Welcome to the Sunday service for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Pensacola. I'm Reverend Alice Silty, and I have the honor of serving this congregation as minister. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone here today to share this time with a community whose mission is to celebrate diversity, strive for justice, and inspire love. I call us into this time with words from the Reverend Scott Taylor. Come into the circle. Come into this circle of compassion and care. Bring your worry and wounds, your longings and hope. With words and song, we rekindle the connection that soothes our tender hearts. With stillness and space to pause, we restore our strength for the work that must be done, the work of love, the work of waiting, the work of repair, the work of remembering we are not alone. Let us begin. And with these words from Eric Heller Wagner and a little help from my worship associate, we will light our chalice and enter into a time of centering with music from Denise D'Angelo. Blessed is the fire that burns deep in the soul. It is the flame of the human spirit touched into being by the mystery of life. It is the fire of reason, the fire of compassion, the fire of community, the fire of justice, the fire of faith. It is the fire of love burning deep in the human heart, the divine glow in every life. My opening words are from the Reverend Richard Gilbert, who after 44 years of ministry seems to have come up with words for every occasion. These are from Becoming, a spiritual guide for navigating adulthood. They seemed really appropriate for today or for this time. Gentleness in living. Be gentle with one another. It is a cry from the lives of people battered by thoughtless words and brutal deeds. It comes from the lips of those who speak them and the lives of those who do them. Who of us can look inside another person and know what is there of hope and hurt or promise and pain? Who can know from what far places each has come or to what far places each may hope to go? Our lives are like fragile eggs. They crack and the substance escapes. Handle with care. Handle with exceedingly tender care, for there are human beings within, human beings as vulnerable as we are, who feel as we feel, who hurt as we hurt. Life is too transient to be cruel with one another. It is too short for thoughtlessness, too brief for hurting. Life is long enough for caring. It is lasting enough for sharing, precious enough for love. Be gentle with one another. I invite you now to join with me in the words of our covenant. Love is the spirit of our church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We come together each week with joys and sorrows, some spoken, some not. Today, I especially want to recognize the sorrow of the passing of Reverend Elaine Bucher. Elaine passed away on Thursday, June 4th, which was her birthday, her 87th birthday. Elaine was a Methodist minister who joined our church in 2014. I spoke with her son, Nate, who let me know how deeply he will miss her constant encouragement. And he talked to me of her high calling and her sense of duty. Elaine had many roles in her life, including minister, religious educator, social worker, counselor. If you knew Elaine, or if you read the story about her in our May newsletter submitted by Charlotte Crane as part of Elaine's nomination to be an honorary lifetime member, then you know she was a remarkable woman and that she will be very much missed by all who knew her. And our hearts are with her son Nate today and in the coming days. There are also celebrations happening in our community. I want to recognize Lisa Hudson's son, Logan Talley, who graduated this year, and Trista Bluen's daughter, Liliana, who graduated also. And as always, there are joys and sorrows that remain in our hearts. So our candle today is for all of those joys and sorrows, unexpressed and expressed. I take us into a time of music, either for meditation or for singing along with these words in our hymnal from Paul Robeson. I shall take my voice wherever there are those who want to hear the melody of freedom or the words that might inspire hope and courage in the face of despair and fear. My weapons are peaceful, for it is only by peace that peace can be attained. The song of freedom must prevail.
Dona nobis pacem, pacem. Dona nobis 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 pacem, pacem. Dona nobis pacem. Dona nobis pacem, pacem. Dona nobis pacem. Dona nobis magis 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 pacem. Dona nobis pacem.
For my message today, I've chosen to share with you a pastoral letter to America from the Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. Perhaps you have heard it already or heard him say it already. I couldn't come up with anything that I thought was better for this message today than his words. He writes, "Dear America, like many of you, I have heard George Floyd cry, 'I can't breathe,' and 'Mama, I love you,' on the recording of his lynching in the streets of Minneapolis. I have watched as crowds of people, black, white, and brown, gay, straight, and trans, have taken to those same streets to cry out against systemic racism. The image of a white officer choking the life out of a black man while fellow officers looked on is viscerally reminiscent of the lynching photographs that were used to terrorize African Americans for decades in this nation. Protesters are right to decry such brutal and inhumane treatment as racism. Thank God people are in the streets, refusing to accept what has been seen as normal for far too long. What a shame it would be if this nation could watch a policeman murder another human being, then pose like a hunter with his prey while his colleagues looked on, and there not be protest, anguish, anger, outrage, and moral disruption. All that is needed to understand why Black people are crying out is to ask what the response of our justice system would have been if a video had emerged of 4 black men doing that to a white man. We all know what racism looks like, but the lethal violence of racist officers is only one manifestation of the systemic racism that is choking the life out of American democracy. In fact, injustice, period, is causing many to question whether this nation's commitment to the establishment of justice means anything at all. George Floyd's murder would have been enough alone, but it comes after the compounded death and deadliness of a pandemic that has wreaked havoc on poor and low-income communities across the nation. More than 100,000 people have said, "I can't breathe," as this disease choked them to death. The coronavirus has spread through the fissures of our society, exposing the inequities we have long accepted like a contrast dye in our body politic. We must be clear, long before COVID-19 came to our shores, 140 million Americans were poor and low income. 700 people were dying every day from poverty in this nation before we declared a national emergency. 80 million people were uninsured or underinsured. When we know that thousands will die every year for every 500,000 uninsured. Last week, Columbia University published a study that said many of the 100,000 Americans we have lost did not have to die. Their deaths are the result of a government that refused to care for its people. Yet too many in political leadership have accepted the greed and wanton disregard for human life that has become normal in our political system. We all know what Americans need to survive in this pandemic: access to health care, living wages, paid sick leave, affordable housing, and the capacity to stay home to slow the spread of the disease. Yet the poorest and most vulnerable Americans are being sent back into harm's way, often without the proper PPE, while 85% of the trillions of dollars we invested in so-called stimulus bills has gone to the wealthiest Americans. So you see, this moment demands that all who care about the American experiment in democracy listen closely and deeply to the uprising that is itself a collective gasp for life. As a pastor, he says, I turn to Scripture in times of crisis. I have prayed with the prophet Isaiah that God would open my ears to offer a word that might sustain those who are distressed. I have prayed with Jeremiah that we will not try to heal the wound of the people lightly and fail to recognize how the wounds of poverty demand social surgery and a strong antibiotic of truth to cleanse a septic democracy. In the church, we are preparing for the season of Pentecost, when we recall how God's Spirit allowed people from various backgrounds to each hear the truth in their own language. I pray this letter might be likewise received. To those who are crying out in Minneapolis and in solidarity actions across the nation, I write to say, I hear you. I hear your cry as a collective expression of the racial wound we have all inherited in this nation. And I join you as we scream because of the constant death-dealing wounds suffered by our people over and over, when all we want is to be free and full citizens. Damn, I hear you, and I hear the echoes of screams from the past and the screams of our children as they head towards a future afraid that they may face more of the same. Forensic scientists tell us that wounds always speak. For those who have ears to hear, the wounds of a victim have something to say about the perpetrator of a crime. What's more, wounds echo, compounded by repetition like a concussion for someone who is struck on the head. We all hear the echo of Eric Garner's last words in George Floyd's "I Can't Breathe." The people of Minneapolis cannot watch this video without reliving the trauma of Philando Castile's murder at the hands of police. From Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin to Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, and Terry Brandon, we all know the names of some who have borne this trauma. But there is also a litany of the lost that each Black community cannot forget. Names and stories that never made the national news, but echo this trauma throughout our communities all the same. Each of us who carry this trauma in our bodies is crying out, "This is screwed up," and it is true. A society that tolerates such disregard for Black life is sick, and we are right to insist that the public note America's symptoms of spiritual death. When the president calls you thugs, he speaks more truth than he knows. Thug is an acronym for the hate you give. It has long been claimed by communities that have experienced criminalization as an assertion that the disruption of rebellion is only a reflection of the hate and violence a community has received. The inevitable reflex of people who cannot breathe because their life is being systematically snuffed out. Mr. President, we know what you are doing when we hear your tough talk and see you using the military as a pawn. We all remember 1968 and the way the call for law and order was used to consolidate power. We are not naive, but we can, as active participants in a fledgling democracy, still imagine better leadership. We still have the capacity to ask, what if leadership in this country was moved to arrest police who destroy and murder people's lives as much as they are to arrest people who destroy property? What if instead of a president who tweets, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," we had leadership that could unequivocally say, when you use police power in the name of the state to murder, lynch, and destroy, you will be prosecuted for your crimes. To those who look at the fires in Minneapolis and say, there must be a better way, I must say that no one wants to see their community burn, but they have also shared how their nonviolent pleas and protests have gone unnoticed for years as the situation has gotten out of hand. No one knows who and what is behind the violence, but we do know that countless activists, grassroots leaders, and preachers were screaming nonviolently long before now, "Change America, change Minneapolis." Rather than listen, many of those in power saw even their nonviolent protests as an unwelcome development. This is so often the case because many Americans struggle to imagine that our government's policies and its long train of abuses demand radical transformation. Too many want to believe racism is merely caused by a few bad actors. We often turn racism into a spectacle, only considering the cruel legacy of racism when an egregious action escalates outrage to this level. Black Americans have rarely been able to sustain such illusions. Deadly racism is always with us, and not only through police brutality. In the midst of the current pandemic, we are painfully aware that our families bear a disproportionate burden of COVID-19 deaths. In some cities where racial data are available, we know that Black people are 6 times as likely to die from the virus as their white counterparts. Even before COVID, large numbers of Black Americans died because of the racial disparities in healthcare, which are systemic and not unintentional. He goes on. African Americans are 3 times more likely to die from particulate air pollution than our fellow Americans. The percentage of Black children suffering from asthma is nearly double that of white people, and the death rate is 10 times higher. This is but a reflection of the fissures of inequality that run through every institution in our public life, where the Black wealth gap, education gap, and healthcare gap have persisted despite the civil rights movement, legal desegregation, and symbolic affirmation and symbolic affirmative action. We understand that the same mentality that will accept and defend the violence of armed officers against unarmed Black people will also send Black, brown, and poor people into harm's way during a pandemic in the name of liberty and the economy. Many have cited Dr. King to remind Americans that a riot is the language of the unheard. But I have been reflecting on the eulogy he offered when another man, a white man who came to Selma, Alabama to work for voting rights, was brutally murdered by racist violence in 1965. At the funeral for James Reeb, Dr. King said, "It is not enough to ask who killed the victim in a case like the murder of George Floyd." Weak and unacceptable charges have been brought against the officer whose knee choked George Floyd, staying on his neck for 3 minutes after he went unconscious. And at this time, there were still no charges that had been filed against the other officers who stood by and watched. So I think that some things changed because of the protest. There were steeper charges. However, he did write this a week ago. So even still, dealing with who did the killing is not all that justice demands. Dr. King said the question is not only who killed him, but also what killed him. The systemic racism that killed George Floyd has taken untold souls from us for over 400 years, and it is killing the very possibility of American democracy today. I join those screaming that this is all screwed up, and it's been screwed up for far too long. But we are not screwed up as long as we have the consciousness and humanity to know what is right and wrong. In fact, we are clothed and in our right minds. We insist that no human being should tolerate such cruelty. Those of us who have faced the lethal force of systemic racism have also learned that we can be wounded healers. We don't have to be arbitrarily destructive. We can be assuredly determined to never accept the destruction of our bodies and dreams as an acceptable reality by any police person or policy. We have learned that there is a force more powerful when hands that once picked cotton have joined together with white hands and native hands, brown hands and Asian hands. We have been able to fundamentally reconstruct this democracy. Slavery was abolished. Women did gain the right to vote. Labor did win a 40-hour work week and minimum wage. The civil rights movement in the face of lynching and shooting did expand voting rights to African Americans. This kind of mourning is what happens, he says, when people have experienced the deadliness of racism, not only through police brutality, but also through racist policies over and over again. That's what we're seeing, public mourning, where people are refusing to be comforted. If we take time to listen to this nation's wounds, they tell us where to look for hope. The hope is in the mourning and the screams which make us want to rush from this place. There is a sense in which right now we must refuse to be comforted too quickly. Only if these screams and tears and protests shake the very conscience of this nation, and until there is real political and judicial repentance, can we hope for a better society on the other side of this. The very people who have been rejected over and over again are the ones who have shown us the possibility of a more perfect union. On June 20th, 2020, poor and low-income Americans of every race, creed, culture, and sexuality are planning a digital mass gathering to lift up a new moral agenda in our public life that promises transformative change to heal the wounds of systemic racism. When the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for the moral revival, set the date for this event almost 2 years ago, we had no way of knowing that over 100,000 Americans would have breathed their last breath due to COVID-19, nor that George Floyd's dying words would have forced the nation to consider how the knee of white supremacy continues to bear down on our common life. But because we have listened to the wounds of this nation, from California to the Carolinas, from Maine to Mississippi, we know where to look for hope. Now is the time to unite our collective power and demand transformative change. Now is the time to revive the heart of America's democracy. I pray you will join us in this collective work. Bishop William J. Barber II, D. Min, co-chair, Poor People's Campaign, a national call for the moral revival. I know that our congregation, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Pensacola, has a long history of fighting for the rights of all people. And it is our support for this church that helps it continue that work. So in the spirit of generosity, we will show the slide for how to text and give to the work of this church while we listen to some music from Denise. For our next song, I chose Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout's improvisation of My Life Flows On in Endless Song.
My life flows on in endless song, above its lamentation. I hear the reel, the far off hymn that heals a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest round me rolls? I know the truth it liveth. What though the darkness round me close? Songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost gone. While to the rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? When diamonds tremble as they beam, the bells of freedom ring. When friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? To breeze and sand and dungeons our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing? My life goes on in endless song, although its lamentation. I hear the breathe of him that is a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing? How can I keep from singing?
I close with these words from our hymnal by the Reverend Wayne Arneson. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone.